If we're going to accurately define classic rock, then I think it's also important to understand the counterculture of the 1960s, which gave birth to the attitude of classic rock in many respects. And particularly with something called the Beat Generation, that had a tremendous influence on the origins of the anti-establishmentism, which has been the sort of mainstay of the attitude of rock and roll, and particularly classic rock.
The Beat Generation, man, that is about as challenging as talking about the hip-hop culture. Because the Beat Generation was more than just the music. It involved counterculture. It involved looking at expanding how you looked at the way you expressed yourself, the way that it was important for you to get your message across. And this also came along with music.
But it's not up to Commissioner Morris to tell the people what kind of music is good or bad. He's telling the people that folk music brings degenerates and bad people. It's not so.
Folk music always had to do with giving people a chance to talk about the struggles and the challenges that they had with life. It was the closest music, like the blues, to what life was really like.
Essentially, a beatnik is someone who associates with the principles of the Beat Generation. Not every beatnik was a folk musician, but you could argue that every folk musician was a beatnik, or at least most of them were, in New York City, in the Greenwich Village neighborhood. In 1961, in April of that year, folk musicians were suddenly banned from playing at the park. And to this day, there hasn't really been any sort of concrete reason given as to why they were banned.
The police to chase criminals?
We are chasing criminals.
You are not chasing criminals. You are here at this moment stopping free speech.
Officer, you got more crooks in this street.
This resulted in the infamous Beatnik Riot, one of the first instances in the 60s where the people stood up against the establishment. The ban was subsequently lifted.
Oh, it absolutely threatened the establishment. I think you're getting closer to a definition of beatnik, which is anything that threatened the establishment was beatnik. And then a couple of years later, anything that threatened the establishment was hippie, right?
In the same sense that Washington Square Park represents one of the epicenters of American folk music, Haight-Ashbury in San Francisco represents the epicenter of psychedelic rock.
Their Big Brother, Grateful Dead, all those kind of people, and they were a lot of that came out of the Haight-Ashbury district. Your Jefferson Airplane, great album, Surrealistic Pillow, just great.
It's a district called the Haight-Ashbury District. It is true that there's a street sign that says Haight-Ashbury, and for some reason it became a place where these new hippie people came, like lemmings or something.
Haight-Ashbury to this day stands as a symbol of the 60s counterculture. And over in the UK, the same can be said for a place called Carnaby Street in London. Carnaby Street was more about the fashion. Mod culture, for instance, was born on Carnaby Street, whereas in Haight-Ashbury, it was all about the music and experimenting with psychedelia. Now, of course, these different interests overlapped with each other in both locations, but the main thing that really tied Carnaby Street and Haight-Ashbury together was that they both personified the attitude of peace and love.
The attitude was simple. It was peace and love, accept each other. Then, of course, the Vietnam War came. The death machine started sucking people up, by the thousands. They were drafting people. the anti-draft movement. So some hippies were getting drafted. They were trying to be peace and love, and then boom, they were drafted.
By the late 1960s, mandatory conscription for the Vietnam War began to reach a climax in the United States.
You had a population born after, during and after World War II that fundamentally questioned everything, right? Their parents, the society as we know it, right? Not just things about the war, but then came the war. Things like Vietnam, became a sort of template for them to question everything.
So then people had to have an attitude about pro-war, anti-war, and it just mushroomed.
And the natural reflection of that is in things like music. So, the protest of seeing the United States mired in this unbelievably savage war, 3/4 of the way around the world, not knowing clearly what they're fighting for, became a sort of icon of this protest, right? Of this sort of reaction they had to their entire generation. And I think it's best seen in music, and it became the rallying cause.
Oh, yeah. Now see, if I had known the slide was going to be there...
It was August.
I would
Yeah, it was.
That's why it was so cool. Yeah. Yeah. But it was still... No, they say, well, that's all those big... It's amazing if you imagine what the... Yeah. Yeah.
Woodstock represents the absolute pinnacle of the 1960s counterculture and a defining moment in the story of classic rock.
It really changed the world, the whole Aquarian age, Woodstock generation. We changed the world.
Taking place in the town of Bethel, New York, an estimated 400,000 people attended the festival in August of 1969. This was really the first festival of any kind when it comes to music that was at this scale, that was at this level.
That was a very powerful time that still resonates with us, even though we weren't there. But I think it was the evolution and the birth of rock music was in that time. Yes, we can go back to the 50s and blues and all that, but to have somebody with a guitar and a microphone saying we are standing against the government, against what's happening in Vietnam.
The music itself was a lot more important than it is now. Music is an adjunct to anyone's life. It's a background to what they're doing in their life at any given moment. And it was actually, in my era, the forefront. And the songs and the lyrics in those songs were more important.
And listening to how you listen to a song from that time and you listen to it now and you think, wow, when that came out, there was so much unrest going on,
So really, it's all pointing to the one obvious thing that we had in the 60s, which seems stupid and crazy, but it isn't: peace and love. Because if we don't figure out a way on this planet to live with peace and love for everybody, we're going to have some crazy killing shit going on, and it's not going to be nice.
Woodstock is well known for having showcased some of the biggest artists in psychedelic rock history. Jimi Hendrix, the Grateful Dead, you name it. After Woodstock, though, the popularity of psychedelic rock began to decline, and in its place came glam and progressive rock, two styles of music heavily influenced by psychedelic.
So I think psychedelic rock and its progression into what became progressive rock has a lot to do with Musicians who were learning about different genres, learned about blues, learned about jazz music, learned about different chord progressions, learned about classical music and how all of that could be infused.
After everybody got done being stoned and started to get straight again, then they started to get into progressive rock. It got very seriously musical again. Even Frank Zappa, talking about progressive rock, and he was the original hippie, but he turned into progressive rock. So one thing led to the other.
Psychedelic music was such an animal of the 60s, really. And then there was heavy rock, punk.
That was a clip from my movie What is Classic Rock. If you want to see the full movie What is Classic Rock, the links are available in the description box below. Everything I do is original, so make sure to subscribe for more.